Okay, so welcome to my introductory video about the Pcaob, that's the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, and SOX. SOX is Sarbanes-Oxley Act. There are 4 learning objectives for today's class. First of all, you should be able to describe the events surrounding the audit crisis of 2002. I'll discuss that in this video. Secondly, you should be able to describe the reforms that were contained in the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. Thirdly, describe the key activities of the Pcaob. And fourthly, did SOX have unintended consequences? So I have a couple of research papers. I'll briefly talk about some of the unintended consequences of these new regulations that were designed to improve financial reporting quality and audit quality. Okay, let me go through the outline for the seminar on the Pcaob and the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. So those were the objectives that I just stated. The reading, you should go through the class questions and the student presentation that are on this seminar outline. Question 2 is relating to Pcaob enforcement actions against an audit firm called Goldstein and Morris, and 2 of the partners who are Goldberger and Postelnick. So if you can read these 2 articles that are on Blackboard, that will help you to answer question 2. And then article 3 and 4, these are the 2 that I'm going to talk about in reference to SOX's unintended consequences, okay? So you don't need to read these because I will discuss them briefly in class, but I've put them as optional reading in case you would like to read them. And then we have a student presentation in this class as well, and this is a reading for that, okay? So this presentation, this reading is from the CPA journal. It's called When Auditors Fail to Audit, Themes from Pcaob Enforcements. The questions that we'll cover in the seminar, first question is about the difference between auditing standards. So these are standards laid down by the AICPA or the Pcaob, and internal quality control standards. So quality control standards are the standards that an audit firm voluntarily puts in place. Okay, so a firm's own internal quality control standards are standards that the firm has voluntarily decided to put in place that are not actually required by auditing standards. Okay, so there's a question on that. Question 2 is about the Goldstein and Morris enforcement action. Okay, so what were the matters that led to Goldstein and Morris's decision to conceal information from the Pcaob? And then what sanctions were imposed on the firm, the managing partner, and the other 2 partners? And do you think that these sanctions were fair? Okay, so to answer question 2, as I say, you need to read these 2 enforcement actions. All right, that's question 2. And then we have some multiple choice questions as well. And then we have the presentation materials. So the presentation materials are coming from newspaper articles. For example, here's one from the New York Times. Here's an article from Accounting Today. Here's another one from Accounting Today. Here's another one. So all of these articles are basically about cases in which the Pcaob has found that the auditors have done a poor job or violated auditing standards, and then the auditors have been punished. So for example, this one is a story about Deloitte being fined $1 million by the Pcaob. Here's one relating to another fine against Deloitte for $2 million by the Pcaob. Okay, so for this presentation, the students are going to talk about the following 3 questions. What kinds of quality control deficiencies were disclosed in the second parts of the inspection reports issued to Big 4 firms? Okay, so when the Pcaob issues an inspection report to an audit firm, it's divided into 2 parts, part 1 and part 2. Part 1 is basically a list of all of the audit engagement deficiencies where the inspectors think that the audit firm failed to comply with auditing standards. And then part 2 is relating to quality control deficiencies. So this question here is asking about the quality control deficiencies that have been found in the Part 2 section of the firm's inspection reports. Second question, do you think that audit firms' quality control deficiencies should be kept secret unless an audit firm fails to correct the deficiencies within 12 months? So basically the rule is that if the PCAOB finds quality control deficiencies, it will not disclose them in Part 2 unless the audit firm fails to correct those deficiencies within a 12-month period. So this is a question asking you whether you think that's a good idea, or do you think that the PCAOB should just disclose them immediately? And then the third question is relating to the fact that some auditors have been sanctioned by the PCAOB. So why were the auditors sanctioned in those cases? Do you think that the penalties were merited? Do you think the penalties are sufficient to deter future infringements by other auditors? Okay, so these are the questions that will be covered in the student presentation. All right, let's go to the PowerPoint slides now. Okay, so these are the learning objectives. The first one, describe the events surrounding the audit crisis of 2002. That's what I'll cover now. Okay, so the crisis of 2002 actually really started in the previous year. Right? In the summer of 2001, the SEC performed some unannounced inspections of the Big Four firms, and it found widespread independence violations. So for example, it found that some of the partners at the Big Four firms owned shares in their clients, which, as you know from a previous seminar, is a violation of the auditor independence rules. Okay, so the SEC was quite perturbed to find this in the summer of 2001, and it made suggestions that auditors needed to improve their independence. So for example, one of the suggestions was that audit firms should not be allowed to provide non-audit services to their clients. Now, the audit profession opposed these reforms, right? They said, no, we're fine. I mean, there may be one or two cases where we need to improve, but we don't need wide-ranging reforms to the profession. Okay, so you can kind of see this illustrated here in this cartoon, right? The auditor is looking at the doctor, and the doctor's giving him an eye test, conflicts of interest, and the auditor's saying, hey, I don't see a thing, doc, right? So basically the auditing profession was saying, we don't see these conflicts of interest, so really there's nothing that needs doing. So that was in the summer of 2001. Then when we came to the winter of 2001, that's when the Enron scandal broke in November, December of 2001. And then moving into the new year of early 2002, Anderson, it was found, had shredded its working papers on the Enron audit, and that led to the indictment of Anderson. So Anderson was then barred from auditing any public companies. But even so, even with the Enron scandal, the auditing profession was still opposing reforms. It said that it didn't need any external regulation, that the profession could self-regulate, it could regulate itself, and it didn't need any outside interference from the government or any other external body. So that was in the first part of 2002, but then in what really broke the straw that broke the camel's back, if you like, was in June 2002, because then we had another scandal, very large scandal involving a company called WorldCom, and the auditor here again was Arthur Andersen, and that really kind of made legislators, the investing public, the media really kind of lost patience with the auditing profession. So then regulators moved very quickly to make changes. So it just took them 1 month to pass the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, right? So you see here, WorldCom was in June, and by the end of July, SOX had already become law. So it was really passed in quite a rush. Not a lot of thought or time went into this law, but that's what we're still left with today. Okay, so what were some of the SOX reforms? That's what I'm going to start talking about now. Well, one of the biggest was that SOX prohibited certain non-audit services being provided by the auditor. Okay, so before 2002, auditors were allowed to provide these additional services, okay, but from 2002 onwards, SOX said that auditors cannot provide these services to public companies. So auditors can still provide these services to private companies. Right? SOX only applies to public companies. But for private companies, there's no prohibition, right? So first one, bookkeeping, right? Obviously there was a view that auditors shouldn't be involved in preparing and auditing the same financial statements, right? So the bookkeeping was disallowed. Financial information systems design and implementation. A company's information system has a very big impact on the accuracy of its accounting. You know, if you have a well-designed information system, that's going to prevent any errors from occurring, minimize the risk of fraud. So if auditors are involved in preparing or advising on these information systems, that could threaten the auditor's independence, because the auditor will say, okay, well, I advised the company on installing this information system, so obviously this information system is working just fine, right? And there won't be any errors. So that was disallowed. Appraisal or valuation services, right? So obviously there are financial reporting implications from this. For example, if a company has land and that land value is being appraised by the auditor, then that's going to impact on the reported value of land in the company's financial statements. So that's another type of service that was banned. Actuarial services. So these are used, for example, when a company is valuing its pension obligations. And so if the auditor is helping the company to value its pension obligations, that has a financial reporting effect. And so it's argued auditors shouldn't do that, because then auditors are essentially preparing and auditing the financial statements. Internal audit, human resources, acting as a broker or dealer, legal services, providing expert opinions. Okay, all of these were deemed to be a threat to independence, and so auditors are not allowed to provide those types of services. Okay, so this had a big effect on auditors' revenues. Right, in 2003, 2004, auditors had a big drop in revenues because they could no longer provide these services to their audit clients. Another type of reform under the Sarbanes-Oxley Act was to audit committees. Okay, so audit committees now have to be fully independent of management. So in other words, you can't have any management sitting on the audit committee. And the audit committee has to only comprise outside directors, that is, directors who are not full-time employees. And in addition, audit committees are now formally responsible for appointing audit firms and for pre-approving non-audit services, right? The reason for appointing audit firms is that it was felt that this would help to reduce the influence that managers have over the choice of audit firm, right? So in other words, a manager can now no longer say to an audit firm, hey, if you don't allow me to report in the way that I want, I will get a different audit firm in. So that now is taken out of management's hands, in theory, and given to the audit committee. And then secondly, pre-approving non-audit services. So then not all non-audit services are banned, right? So if we go back to the list here, you'll note, for example, that tax services are not banned. Right? Auditors are still allowed to provide tax services. So those services that are not banned have to be approved by the audit committee, right? And then the company can pay the auditor to perform those non-audit services. Another requirement was this period known as a cooling off period. So this was to reduce the threat to auditor independence that occurs when an auditor leaves an audit firm to go and work for a client. Okay, so the direction here is going from an audit firm to becoming a client employee. So there's a cooling off period introduced of 1 year before the audit team member can accept employment in a financial reporting role at a client. right? So for example, imagine you're auditing a client in June of 2021, and the client says to you, hey, we'd really like you to come in as our controller, right? Because we think that you've done a really great job on our audit. Then you would have to resign from the audit first of all, but then you'd also have to wait another 12 months before you can accept that employment position, okay? All right, so that's a cooling off period. And then there was also partner rotation introduced every 5 years. So this applied to the lead audit partner. This wasn't such a big deal actually, because even before the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, partners were required to be rotated every 7 years already. So all this did really was reduce that period from 7 years to 5 years. Okay, so there was a lot of audit partner rotations taking place subsequent to SOX. Another very important part of SOX was Section 404. Okay, now Section 404 can be divided into two parts. You've got 404A and 404B. Okay, so let me talk to you about what these two parts of Section 404 involve. So Part A requires all public companies to include a report from management on the effectiveness of internal controls over financial reporting. All right? So every public company has to provide a management report, right, on whether or not the controls are effective. Now, Part B only applies to companies that are accelerated filers. Okay, what's an accelerated filer? Well, an accelerated filer is a company whose public float is at least $75 million. Okay, so in other words, an accelerated filer is a relatively large company, right? It has to meet this criterion that the public float is at least 75 million. So for these larger companies, they're required to have their auditor attest to management's assessment of the effectiveness of internal controls. All right, so basically Part A requires a management report in every case. Every public company has a management report on internal controls. And then if you're an accelerated filer, you also have to have an audit report on internal controls. The CEO and CFO have to certify the financial statements and disclosures are fairly presented. So the logic for this is that prior to SOX, the auditor was giving an opinion on whether the financial statements are fairly presented. That was in the audit report, but it was argued that, you know, managers are kind of getting off too easily because they're not being required to state that actually the financial statements are fairly presented, right? So this, it was thought, would help to increase the perceived litigation risk for managers, right? That if you force them to say that the financial statements are fairly presented, then it turns out they're not fairly presented, then it would be easier for investors to sue the company's CEO and CFO. So that was another reform. And then finally, it's unlawful for any officer or director to influence, coerce, manipulate, or mislead any external auditor. So, I mean, this may sound obvious, right, that this should be something that is written into law, but actually before the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, it wasn't, right? So it wasn't actually illegal for an officer or director to lie to an auditor or try to bribe an auditor, right? But that was made illegal after the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. Okay, another very major reform under the Sarbanes-Oxley Act was the establishment of the Pcaob. That's the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. And the Pcaob has essentially three types of responsibilities. The first one is standard setting. The second one is audit firm inspections. And the third one is investigations. Okay, so in terms of standard setting, what this means is that the Pcaob is writing the standards or the guidelines for how auditors should conduct their work, right? So this is basically telling auditors what they need to do on an audit, and if they fail to comply with these standards, that means that the audit is deficient and could lead to the audit firm being sued by investors. Okay, so that's standard setting. Then you've got inspections. In terms of inspections, the large audit firms are inspected every year. Smaller audit firms, that's firms with less than 100 issuer clients, they are inspected every 3 years. And then you have these investigations that occur on a need-to basis, right? So these are not like occurring regularly for audit firms. You have regular inspections, but the investigations are where the PCAOB has some reason to believe that the audit firm has been doing a bad job and needs to be investigated. Okay, so you have these investigations also taking place, and these often lead to enforcement actions against the audit firm, or maybe a fine against the audit firm. So I've given you here some of the web links for standard setting, investigations, and inspections. So let me just show you what you can find at those links. So if you go to the auditing standards link, you'll see here all of the auditing standards listed. Right. So you've got all the general standards here. You've got the specific procedures that auditors have to follow during the audit. You have the standards relating to audit reporting. These have changed quite a bit in recent years. Okay. And then you have some other matters down here. Okay, so that's where you'll find information about the standards. Something that you ought to know about with the standards is that they were reorganized and given different names. Okay, so prior to reorganization, these are the names that they were given here. Okay, so you've got AU section 110, for example, AS8, AU section 161, etc. So these were the old names or the old labels given to the standards, and these are the new labels that PCAOB has tried to tidy up the numbering of these standards. Okay, and you also have the inspections. So here are the inspections page. So if you go to this page, you'll find lots of information about the inspection process, what the inspectors have found. And if you want to look up a specific inspection report for an audit firm, you can do so if you click on this link here. And you can pick an audit firm, like for example, here's Crow LLP. You can download its inspection report. Right, so you've got this summary, table of contents. Remember I told you earlier that there's a part 1 and part 2, right? So part 1 is containing information on the engagement deficiencies that were found at the audit firm, and part 2 is relating to any quality control deficiencies. And then in the appendix, you have the firm's response to what the inspectors found. Sometimes the firm agrees with what the inspectors find, sometimes the firm disagrees. Okay, so the first part of this is largely kind of boilerplate information. You've got information here on how many audits were reviewed, etc. Okay, if you scroll down, you got information here on the inspection results by industry for each issuer that is audited by Crow. Okay, you've got audits with multiple deficiencies, audits with single deficiencies. Okay, and then this is kind of like the key information. For each issuer where a deficiency is found, the PCAOB lists the actual deficiency or describes the deficiency. Notice that the PCAOB does not disclose the name of the company, right? So it just says issuer A. It doesn't say which company this actually affects. Okay, so that was part 1. So in this particular report, this audit firm only had actually one client that was found to have a deficiency, but it had multiple deficiencies. And then part 2 is where you get a disclosure of quality control deficiencies if the audit firm has not remediated those deficiencies within a period of 12 months. And you can see here there is no disclosure here. So What that means is either the firm didn't have any quality control deficiencies, or it did, but it actually remediated those deficiencies within 12 months. So that's the inspections, and then the enforcement page is shown here. So here's where you learn the information on which audit firms have been inspected, what were the results of the investigations. So for example, it says here, for the year 2019, there were 30 settlements, right, disciplinary orders being issued, 27 individuals, 19 firms were sanctioned. There were 4 firms whose registrations were revoked. So that means these audit firms are no longer allowed to audit public companies. 12 firms required to improve their quality control procedures. 23 individual auditors that were barred or suspended. 14 told to go back to school, right? Required to attend continuing professional education. 6 auditors restricted from acting in certain capacities, right? So for example, they were prevented from being a partner or engagement quality reviewer. Okay, so anyway, if you explore this web page, you'll find a lot more information relating to different types of investigations and enforcement actions that were issued, right? So here, for example, is the list for 2019. Here are all the audit firms and the individual auditors who were being sanctioned. Okay. All right, so that's where you'll find information on the standards, inspections, and investigations. The PCAOB standards are listed on this website. That's what I've just shown you. Now, most of those standards actually were originally written by the AICPA, and then they were subsequently adopted by the PCAOB. So when the PCAOB took over the role of writing auditing standards for the profession, it took the standards that were already written by the AICPA, and then it slowly started to change some of those standards. So if you see an auditing standard with AU at the beginning of the name, right, so AU and then a number, that means that this standard was originally written by the AICPA, and then later it was adopted by the PCAOB. If instead it has AS, that denotes a standard that was written originally by the PCAOB. And then, as I mentioned before, if you look at this document, the PCAOB has actually renumbered all of the standards in order to try and tidy up the numbering. Okay, so if I go back to here, I can show you what I mean. Okay, so for example, AU section 110, this was an auditing standard originally written by the AICPA, but it was adopted by the PCAOB, and currently it has the number 1001. On the other hand, if we take this standard here, AS8, AS8 was originally written by the PCAOB, so it wasn't adopted from the AICPA, but afterwards AS8 was given a new number, and its new number is AS1101. Okay, so you can see that's the case for all of these standards, right? They're either originally written by the AICPA, in which case they have the AU abbreviation, or they are originally written by the PCAOB, right? In which case they have the AS abbreviation. Okay, now the most controversial and the most important of the standards that were written by the PCAOB was AS5, and this is now numbered as AS2201. This is the auditing standard that relates to internal control audits, and I'll have a lot more to say about this standard as we go through the course. Okay, but anyway, this is the most significant of the standards that was written by the PCAOB, created a lot of controversy because many companies were saying it's far too costly to require internal control audits for accelerated filers. Okay, so that brings us to question 1. So in question 1, I want to know what's the difference essentially between an auditing standard versus a firm's own quality control standard. Right, so I've got a list of 8 types of policies or procedures that a firm might have. Some of these are required by the PCAOB. Some of them are actually just the firm's own voluntary standard, right? Its own quality control standard. So I just want you to tell me which one is which. Is it A or is it B for these 8? Okay, so that's where we'll start the class. Thank you very much for watching this video.